The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of Scugog Island First Nation, the Mississauga peoples, and the treaty territory of the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. Anin Bojo, Jennifer Henderson Indigenous, Oshawa Donjaba, Anishinaabe Kwe Minwa Jaganash Kwe Minwa Kashta, and Dao. Greetings and thank you for joining us today. We are grateful and humbled by your presence. We would like to acknowledge the presence of your ancestors and all of creation as we gather together in this place and space today. I am the Indigenous Education Coach at Durham District School Board. The land that I am benefiting from today is the land and waters of the Michi-Saagiig and Anishinaabe. My treaty partners are Alderville First Nation, Curve Lake First Nation, and Hiawatha First Nation. These lands and waters promote my life and the life of my family. They nourish us and sustain us every minute of every day. Miigwech.
Bonjour, Nangwagan Indigenous, Nagigdo Dam, Anishinaabe Métis and Dao. We welcome all of you to our online community of care during these interesting days. We are grateful our humble offering of community building, of nation building, of resistance is being so well received. There are many people here with whom we have deep relationships and respect. Among us, we have fluent language speakers, survivors of Canada's ongoing genocide against Indigenous people, including the residential school system. The DDSB Advisory Circle is also here and are instrumental in guiding us as we activate the requests of Indigenous youth and families. As we create our digital ethical community of care, I draw your attention to the slide to highlight our framework for today. We ask that we consider ourselves to be co-learners. We honor the diversity of Indigenous knowledges present in this virtual forum, and we seek to practice non-extractive forms of thinking and actions. And of course, the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People frame our entire offering. Today, I am really excited and a little bit nervous to have Dr. Pam Palmater here. For those who have sat in conversations with us, we always mention her academic work, her activism. She's a little bit of a rock star to us, both modeling for us how we from a place of love of our nationhood, ask for systems to change, and how we ask for, as I get emotional, how we ask for systems to see us as sovereign nations. So Dr. Palmater, I'm really excited to have you here. Miigwech.
Thank you so much. Kwe Nindaluizi Pam Palmater. I'm from the sovereign Mi'kmaq Nation on unceded Mi'kmaqi territory, and my home community is Eel River Bar First Nation. But today, in the virtual world, I'm actually coming to you from Scugog territory in the Durham region. I'm so happy to be part of this region, and I'm really glad that you asked me to talk today, because we're at a time now where it is becoming more and more critical to engage on Indigenous issues, and not just Indigenous peoples. It's literally everybody. And the fact that you're making this space for Indigenous voices is really important. I mean, it's part of co-learning, co-sharing, the knowledge exchange, and really about empowering one another to make changes for all of this. And, you know, it's also the first time I've ever had an organization say to me, you get to talk about whatever you want to. That was really shocking, because it's usually, this is what we want, this is the format, this is the time. And, you know, I respect that too, because everybody's doing different things. But wow, like, that's very refreshing to say, hey, you can talk about what you want and for as long as you want. That's pretty amazing, because it means that I get to help decide what we should focus on. What are some of the things I think you should know the most as Durham region educators? And, I kept changing my mind all week. Should it be this? Should it be that? Should it be this? And then I realized it's not just me you're hearing from, which is another really important thing about your series here. This isn't a one-off event. You're also hearing from Negon Sinclair. You're also hearing from Christy Belcourt and many other voices, because we're all different. We all have different views and different experiences, and you can't put First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people all in the same group and have one pan-Indigenous approach. So I really like that. I'm hoping that everybody online watches this video at least 10 times each so I can beat Negon's numbers. That's my plan. But until then, I want to talk to you about I decided with all the things I want to talk to you about that I'm just going to combine it all into one, because right now, Indigenous peoples are facing 3 major overlapping crises. We have the COVID pandemic, we have this crisis of racism, and particularly police racism and violence, but also the pre-existing crisis of genocide that hasn't been addressed, that is complicating all of these things. And for as best as I can within the time that I have, I really think it's important for you to understand the underlying context for all of these issues. And you might think, wait a second, how does that relate to me as an educator? And trust me, it will, but you have to have the context to understand how to put that into your education context in terms of teaching and professional development and personal development and community obligations, for example. And some of the things that I'm going to talk about are very difficult. I don't sugarcoat anything. I don't minimalize anything. I deal with it directly, but some of the things I deal with are very hard. They're difficult, they're violent, they're traumatic. People have experienced it. So I completely understand if this is something that you have to take a break from, or you can only watch in bits and pieces. But as difficult as it is, keep in mind how difficult it is for Indigenous peoples to have lived through and continue to live through. So it's important that we push through the difficulties as much as we can and get to the place where we can actually deal with the ramifications of ongoing colonization, racism, violence, and injustice. And what I really like is that you're embracing this difficulty at a time when governments, schools, universities, colleges, institutions, they would prefer to focus on inspirational messages, positive messages, not making anyone feel bad or uncomfortable. But I've always thought that if reconciliation feels good, we're not doing it. It's simply not reconciliation, because think of how violent colonization was. Decolonization is not going to be a walk in the park. It's really the transfer of power and wealth and resources back to Indigenous peoples, and that's going to make a lot of people uncomfortable. And so is deconstructing all of the systems that this society has been built on that kills Indigenous peoples but benefits others. So whenever there is a rebalancing of injustices, for some people that causes difficulty, but we should embrace that difficulty, because here's the really powerful thing about human beings and societies. In any society that's ever accomplished anything amazing, like a democratic revolution, an advancement in human rights, in women's rights, in protections for the environment or Indigenous rights, it didn't come without difficulty and conflict and protest and marches and debate and pushing and pushing. And that's how we've achieved everything we have so far. So imagine if instead of avoiding the discomfort, that we actually embrace it and speed up this process. Because if there's one thing I know for sure, is that the status quo is consistently reinforcing its barriers and its walls. We cannot treat it around the edges. We have to deal with it directly. And if we don't demolish it, we're not going to get substantive change. We'll get to celebrate Indigenous peoples on Indigenous Day or learn about Natives in Native History Week, and that'll be the end of it. But everything still continues to get worse for Native people on the ground. And that's what we don't want. We don't want reconciliation to go off the rails and cause more harm than good. So I know that that's difficult, but I'm glad you're doing it, because as difficult as it is, we need to keep talking about it. And the more we dig into the truth exposes the problems. And it's only when we know the true nature and scope of the problems that we can find and implement the solutions that deal with the problems. If we continue to advance what's called cultural awareness training in policing, or cultural sensitivity training in boardrooms, that's why nothing ever changes. Because the problem isn't our culture. It's never been our culture. The problem has been about the white supremacy that underlies this entire system in this country, and it's about overt and systemic racism. And until we break those things down, we're not going to change anything. So, I mean, we have Canada, who has always been historically engaged in this huge public relations campaign. You know, Canada is diverse, it's multicultural, it has human rights protections, native rights protections, but meanwhile, it's guilty of genocide and ongoing genocide. So you've got this real disconnect between what the leaders tell Canadians and the world versus what's actually happening. So Canadians are being sold a bill of goods that doesn't reflect reality. So when they see these things in the media like no water, no housing, and they say, well, but Canada treats Native people so good, it must be the fault of Native people. And you've got this really bad discourse that happens, or victim blaming. And so education is really key to that, but not just education. Oh, my pet peeve is doing education for the sake of it, to, you know, tick off a checkbox to say, look, we did that for Native History Week. Education is about action. So everything that we learn about Indigenous issues comes with a corresponding responsibility to take action in whatever forum or format that you work in, live in, volunteer in. That's literally the obligation that we have here, because cultural awareness training isn't going to do it. The problem's not with our culture. And on the ground, while this whole cottage industry of cultural awareness training booms under the guise of reconciliation, all of our socioeconomic conditions get worse on the ground. Violence continues against Indigenous women and girls. Police are brutalizing, sexually assaulting, and killing Indigenous peoples at horrendous rates. And that's not our fault. It is not our fault. I feel like I have to say this 1,000 times. Navigating, trying to survive the minefield of genocide, which is system-wide, government-wide, society-wide, is not our fault. But we're the ones engaged in the frontline actions to try to bring Canadians on board, educators on board, everybody, to help dismantle that system, because it's not going to do it by itself. But before I really get into the details of that, it's really important to understand that our story doesn't start with Canada, and it doesn't start with genocide, and it doesn't start with murdered or missing Indigenous women and girls. That's not our story. Our story has been here on Turtle Island from time immemorial, like far longer than any archaeological finds dig up every year. And every year it's like, oh, it's 10,000 years. Oh, it's 50,000 years. Oh, it's 100,000 years. Well, would you look at that? It could be even later. Yeah, kind of like we've been telling you with our Indigenous knowledges. But our story is pre-contact, long before the violent colonization of Indigenous lands and bodies in what is now known as Canada. We were sovereign, independent nations with our own sophisticated governments, political systems, legal regimes, and trading networks. We also had our own economies, manufacturing, trade. We had our own militaries. We did, in fact, defend our territories. We knew what it meant to occupy, use, and govern and manage territories. We weren't without these concepts. And we had rich, beautiful, it's like spirit-filling cultural traditions, customs, practices, and our worldviews and belief systems, and all of our like math and science and astronomy were all interwoven into our languages. I mean, literally, the name of a river could tell you whether or not you could fish there, or whether it was a dangerous river, all within our languages. And that is something that's just a beautiful thing to have. It's a beautiful thing to be a part of. And although our governing systems weren't the same, we come from diverse nations. We weren't all just one mythical Indian race. We were the Mi'kmaq Nation and the Haudenosaunee and the Haida and Wet'suwet'en. And so we're all different. All of our languages, cultures, and traditions. We're like the United Nations of Turtle Island. And we had different ways of governing, none better than the others. Sometimes we had sachems, sagamas, ogamas, elders. We had hereditary leaders, leaders of clans and houses. And the important thing here is that our leaders came in a wide variety of formats. Men and women and people of diverse gender backgrounds were as much a part of our nations as anybody else in our nations. And so with our traditional Indigenous laws and theories and legal traditions that we refined over time and passed on orally and in writing and in art and in other cultural ways, that this has been and continues to be an important part of who we are, and is actually the foundation of our sovereignty. We are still sovereign nations. We're still independent. It might be interrupted. We might be interfered with. It might be oppressed at the moment, and we might be dispossessed of lots of our lands, but that hasn't impacted our sovereignty, because that's one thing that we have never surrendered. So these things, these systems, these ways of governing, none of that was surrendered on contact. None of that you will find surrendered in treaties, whether they're numbered treaties, pre-Confederation treaties, Robinson-Huron treaties. And the role of women pre-contact was pretty kick-ass. And it didn't matter where you came from, whether it was, Cree or Mi'kmaq. Native women were powerful. We were a force to be reckoned with. And not only did we have sovereignty within our nations, we had sovereignty over our own lives. And that's a critical part of the discussion that doesn't get talked about in, modern forms of democracy. And it's true, Indigenous women appear in many of our creation stories as central to the roles of our nations because we're life givers. We actually bridge the spirit world and the human world by bringing babies into the world, nurturing them into adulthood, and helping to take care of large extended families. But that wasn't our only role. One of our most important roles in nation building was being leaders and political strategists and negotiators and interpreters, and the ones who decided who was going to be the head warrior or the head hunter, or who could hunt in a certain territory. These are very powerful positions, and they were very much rooted and grounded in our territories and in our lands. And so Indigenous women were leaders in their own right. And, while our nations were very diverse and this unraveled in different ways in different nations, it doesn't take away from the fact that we were very critical in the governance and defense of our nations and the well-being of our people. And Native women were loving and caring, but we were also strong, powerful, and formidable, and a force to be reckoned with. And that's exactly why settler governments when they came to this country, they looked at the lay of the land. They knew that they had an Indian policy for all Indigenous peoples, but they also took specific aim at Native women for that reason, because of our power and because of our centrality to our nations. And we know that Indian policy in general was about, one, acquiring Indigenous lands and resources and trade networks, but two, it was also about reducing financial obligations that they had acquired through treaties and other agreements. But they only used two methods. It was either elimination or assimilation. And we all know how destructive that has been. So governments engaged in things like smallpox blankets to spread infections of smallpox. They had scalping bounties here on the East Coast that almost wiped out the Mi'kmaq population. And from the very earliest days, Indian agents worked with the very first police forces, the Northwest Mounted Police, which later became the RCMP, to withhold food rations from First Nations that were trapped on reserves, to extort sex from Indigenous women and young girls. So the very first instances of sexual exploitation and sexualized and racialized violence against Indigenous women and girls actually comes from the police forces in this country. Sometimes we think it's residential schools, but it's actually the police forces. And that long history has continued all the way until today. On the East Coast, the people who were traveling back and forth overseas on boats would kidnap Mi'kmaq people, young Mi'kmaq girls, tie them up and use them as sex slaves on their ships, never to be seen again. And what is shocking to many people is that they still celebrate that on Heritage Days. I mean, they've posted paintings of Mi'kmaq girls tied up on store windows as part of Heritage Days, which is basically a celebration of sexual exploitation, violence, and death of Indigenous peoples. So think about, in addition to all of that, you move forward and children are literally being ripped out of the arms of their mothers to go into residential schools. And I don't need to talk about all of the things that happened there, except to say there was a lot of abuse, torture, medical experimentation, and death. In some schools, the death rate was as high as 40%. So we're not talking about, oops, we meant to give you an education. We're talking about very widespread genocide. And in the past, Indigenous women and girls were subjected to forced sterilizations, forced abortions, sometimes without their knowledge even or consent. And for those that survived this process, this very early on process of genocide, then Canada's Indian Act comes around in 1876, and various iterations still exist today, targeted First Nation women and their children for exclusion from the Indian Act. And multiple generations, well over 100 years of taking people away from their communities, from their treaty rights, from their territories, and permanently disconnecting them. While there have been amendments to the Indian Act since, there are still tens of thousands who were never registered and never will be registered. And so the other thing they did, in addition to try to get rid of as many Native women as possible from First Nation communities, is completely prevent them from having any voice in politics, in governance, in say over treaties, over land, and a lack of voice over not allowing Indian agents, police officers, you name it, to commit violence on the bodies of Indigenous women and girls. By removing their voices in all of these forums, they weren't allowed to say no. And the greatest genocides have been committed against Indigenous peoples by not allowing them the right to say no. And yes, that means a veto. No means no in every context. It's not, we consult with you and we'll take your views into account, whether it's sexual assault, medical consent, parental consent, or what happens to Indigenous peoples. No means no. And because it hasn't meant no, because colonial governments and post-colonial governments have ignored the right to say no, that's how genocide has continued. But think about it. We have been subjected to 500 years of genocide. Now, look at how powerful and amazing our nations were, and how hard and how long colonizing governments and institutions have had to work to try to wipe us off the face of the earth. A, they weren't successful, but B, they have left a long line of trauma in their wake, because the only reason why impoverished socioeconomic conditions exist today is because of the genocide machine of 500 years. And that really stands as a testament to our resilience that we're still here. So while some media commentators may look and say, oh, look at their impoverished conditions, why don't they pull up their socks? We're saying, I'd like to see you survive 500 years of genocide and then see how well you end up. And we are still here. We're still proud. We're still dancing in the streets, whether it's Idle No More, Wet'suwet'en Strong, or No Justice, No Peace, No Racist Police. That's how powerful we are, and we have everything that we need within our nations to make this change. We just need our Canadian partners to come along with us and use their power, their wealth, their influence, their education, and all of their numbers to push governments in the right direction. So that's why I start with pre-contact, because it's important to understand how powerful and amazing our people are before we start talking about the results of genocide, because genocide isn't our fault. There's nothing wrong with our cultures, nothing wrong with our worldviews or our biologies that have ended up here. This lies at the feet of genocide. And the National Inquiry into Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls told us a year ago now, June 3rd, 2019, that after reviewing thousands of witness testimony, after doing an independent evidence-based analysis and legal analysis, they have found that Canada is guilty of historic and ongoing genocide. And what does that mean? You've got people saying, well, it's not genocide if it's not the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a horrific genocide, but is not the standard of genocide. The legal standard of genocide has 5 criteria. It's killing members of a group, or physical and mental harm to a group, or creating the conditions of life meant to bring about the destruction of the group, preventing births in the group, or transferring the children of that group to another group with the intention of destroying that group in whole or in part. So contrary to popular belief, genocide is not wiping out all Indigenous peoples. It's all of the things that Canada has done to us. And it should be no surprise that the National Inquiry found, in fact, that Canada was guilty of all 5. You need only be guilty of 1 to be a state perpetrator of genocide. Canada is guilty of all 5. And no, it didn't do it unintentionally. And no, it wasn't benign. And no, it wasn't a mistake. The National Inquiry found, and I quote, that Canada's colonial history provides ample evidence of the existence of a genocidal policy, a manifest pattern of similar conduct which reflects an intention to destroy Native peoples. And they also found that Canada's steady intention to destroy Indigenous peoples has lasted into modern times, despite the many ways in which Canada has renamed its policies or issued apologies. Their underlying intention is still to destroy Indigenous peoples through assimilation, elimination, land theft, you name it. They're still doing it knowingly. And that's why Canada's guilty. So we know genocide wasn't benign. It wasn't a mistake. We know the historical examples, smallpox, scalping bounties, the mass murders of the Beothuk, for example, starvation policies, ethnic cleansing on the prairies, residential schools, 60 scoop forced adoptions. But the question I often get asked is, okay, well, give me one example of modern genocide. And I'm like, oh my gosh, one example, here, let me give you 200. But I'll start with a few. The deaths of Indigenous women and girls in police custody at grossly disproportionate rates, yeah, that classifies as genocide. The failure of police to protect them from exploitation, human traffickers, and child porn rings, genocide. The failure to knowingly not protect them from serial killers like Robert Pickton, yes, that's genocide. Taking our children and placing them into foster care and group homes at rates higher than residential schools, and we already know that residential schools was found under the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to be a form of genocide, that yeah, that's genocide. You're doing it 3 times worse than you were during residential schools. The physical, mental, and sexual abuse of Indigenous women and girls in state institutions, including schools, hospitals, prisons, group homes, and corrections. Yeah, that's all forms of genocide. Sexualized violence is a form of genocide, well recognized by the United Nations. The continued denial of Indian status and banned membership to people so they can't belong to their communities, so that there continues to be a legislative extinction date for First Nations in this country. Yeah, that's a very purposeful and intentional legal way to try to destroy an entire group. Forced and coerced sterilizations and abortions, that continue to happen today. We're literally still having class actions because this is continuing. And the purposeful and chronic underfunding of essential social services like food, water, health, housing, education creates the conditions of life meant to destroy the group. You've got genocide multiple times over, and it continues. So think about that. Every Native student that you meet in your classroom comes from this context of ongoing genocide. So think about education for a child or a young adult in that context, and the struggle and the difficulties, especially when you don't see any of that reality reflected, because we don't want kids to know too much, or we feel that it would be too disturbing for them to know some of these things, when really their reality is being denied. Similarly, the ongoing violent genocide is really the direct root cause found by both the National Inquiry into Murder of Missing Indigenous Women and various UN human rights treaty bodies in different contexts in terms of human rights as the result of the impoverished socioeconomic conditions. And I'm going to review some of those socioeconomic conditions now because it's important to understand just how severe they are. But I'm going to preface my remarks with the fact that what I said at the beginning, there's no such thing really as one group of Indigenous peoples. We're First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And even amongst First Nations, we're completely diverse. We come from, between 50 and 60 traditional Indigenous nations. We are not all the same. We live in different parts of Turtle Island. We have different experiences, different timelines here, different legal rights, different political ideologies. So it's not appropriate to say all of this applies to all people in all the same ways. For the purposes of this discussion, I'll use mostly Indigenous, combined statistics. But it's important to know that in many of the statistics, First Nations are grossly overrepresented. Or in some of them, it's the Inuit who suffer the most acute circumstances. That doesn't mean that it's a race to the bottom or it's a competition. But there has to be some realization that pan-Aboriginal solutions are not going to work. If the Métis were underrepresented in pandemics in the past, but First Nations were the majority, then when looking at tailored solutions, you have to take those kinds of things into account. Again, that's not a competition. That's not a better or worse. But we are not all one mythical race of people. In fact, there's no such thing as an Indigenous person. We're a Mi'kmaq person or a Haudenosaunee or from the Métis Nation or one of the Inuit communities. And so please think about the statistics in that context. So we know that all Indigenous peoples make up 5% of Canada's population. But in terms of those who are imprisoned, so in federal institutions, 30% of all of those incarcerated are Indigenous. But if you look at Indigenous women, 42% of women in federal institutions are Indigenous women. And Indigenous youth are 50% of all of those incarcerated. But you can't, and as alarming as those numbers are, it's worse in many provincial institutions. So the national numbers, keep in mind, are almost always lower than the provinces. So if you look at the province of Manitoba, they have, and it's always plus or minus a bit, about 80% of some of their provincial jails are Indigenous peoples. Now that's incredibly alarming. And then if you look at the Indigenous peoples who are in federal institutions and provincial institutions, more than 2/3 of them came from the foster care system, and 1/5 of them came from residential schools. So that tells you something about the impact of genocide and trauma on Indigenous peoples. More than 85% of Indigenous women who are incarcerated at any point in time have suffered from physical and/or sexual abuse prior to even getting to prison. So they were trying to navigate a situation of violence. Now, youth corrections is very alarming. I mean, you've got nationally 50% of all those incarcerated in youth corrections is Indigenous, but in provinces like Saskatchewan, of all the boys that are in youth corrections, 92% are Indigenous boys, but for girls, it's 98%. They expect within the next year or two, that could be 100%. And so you can't tell me that racism is not at the heart of this. It's not even a statistical anomaly. I mean, you could have a little bit more or a little bit less, but you're talking about rates that are almost 100%. The majority of those came from the foster care system. That should be no surprise. And many of them also suffer abuse while they're in corrections. So let's talk about the foster care system. We know again that Indigenous peoples are 5% of the population. When you're talking about Indigenous youth, they're about 7%, but they make up 50% of all kids in care across the country. But in the province of Manitoba, they make up 90%. And about 85% of those are First Nations children. So we're talking about a very specific targeting of one specific Indigenous group in provinces like Manitoba. In Saskatchewan, it's 85%. Sometimes it's higher. In foster care, while there are some situations that have worked out, we know statistically that they're 4 times more likely to be sexually abused. And all of those who are sexually abused by their foster parents, 2/3 of those are girls. They are less likely to graduate high school. In fact, less than 50% of Indigenous kids in BC were able to graduate from high school, but more likely to end up in youth corrections. 85% of all situations of Indigenous children in foster care break down by the age of 16. So what does that mean? They run away, they get arrested, they're in youth corrections, or they're living on the streets, or they're living in precarious housing. We are taking them from situations of poverty, statistically, more likely situations of poverty, and putting them into a situation of foster care where we are condemning their life chances going forward, condemning them to be more likely in youth corrections, which means you're more likely to go to prison, which means you're more likely to have a difficult scenario in providing for your family in the future. So we are creating a vicious cycle that doesn't have to exist because of these underlying racist assumptions that taking children away from their native parents is somehow better than leaving them with their native parents. And that ideology has not stopped since contact, no matter what politicians have to say today. So that brings us to another route that happens for First Nations children in care: murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. We know that nationally, there's 7 times the homicide rate at a time when the homicide rate has gone down for Canadians, when crime rates have gone down. We know that in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they represent over 50% of those who go murdered and missing. They're the #1 target of human traffickers and serial killers. And guess what is their most favorite place to take children for human trafficking? Outside of group homes and hotels where foster kids are housed and unsupervised or abused themselves. It should be no surprise that we're in the situation that we're in. We also can't forget that police officers and corrections officers are a significant number of the perpetrators and predators of Indigenous women and girls. For many human rights or human trafficking and child porn rings, when they do massive stings, you almost always find teachers, doctors, and police officers in those sexual exploitation rings. We know from Human Rights Watch reports that RCMP officers have been reported as sexually assaulting, raping, and abusing, stalking, and harassing Indigenous women and girls for decades. We know from other human rights reports in Saskatchewan that they use strip searching to humiliate and degrade and sexually harass Indigenous women for no reason. And we also know that although the national statistics are 16%, in provinces like Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they're well over 50%. And all of this happens with a high level of impunity. So not only is it hard enough for families of murdered and missing to get the police to open a file, but then it's to get the police to do an investigation. You're hoping that it's not the police officer themselves who did it. And then whether or not they're ever going to follow up on it. And what police officers consider clearance by determining that they're going to press a charge or they're not going to press a charge, or the, you know, the lazy way out where they say, oh, it's an undetermined death, or maybe it was a suicide. And you have a situation where society is being told time and time again that there's a high level of impunity for violence and exploitation of Indigenous women and girls. It should be no surprise that it continues. If police officers can get away with it, and human traffickers can get away with it, of course people in society are going to get away with it. And to the response that people say, well, it's all Native men doing it to Native women, the National Inquiry put that debate to rest. In fact, the vast majority of partners of Indigenous women and girls are non-Native people. And the Toronto Star did their own investigation and showed that more than 50% of the people that murdered or disappeared Indigenous women and girls were not even known to the person, strangers. So these racist responses to the crisis that's before us prevents us from actually engaging and stopping it. And sadly, some of this is being taught in universities and colleges as though it's the balanced response. Well, on one response, you have what Indigenous, the National Inquiry is saying, and on the other side, well, you're going to have to, you know, have a racist article from someone who has an opposite view so that you have balance. But that's not balance. You either have genocide or you don't. And we have to, in education, stop focusing obsessively on this concept that balance means polar opposites. That means committing a crime and not committing a crime. And it's not that at all. So we have to, you know, think about education differently. Now, if you look at what's happening right now in terms of police killings, we know that we're still only 5% of the population, but nationally, CBC's investigation Deadly Force found that 16% of those that are killed by police are Indigenous peoples. So that's about 4 times their population numbers. The RCMP number that we know of is 36% of all of their killings are Indigenous peoples, but they don't track race. So statistical experts expect that it's much higher than that. But now look at other regions, you know, so regions where there's high rates of foster care and high rates of murdered and missing. Should be no surprise that Manitoba and Saskatchewan are maxing out for the number of police killings. The Native population in Manitoba is 16%, and they represent 58% of all of police killings. In Saskatchewan, it's only 15% of the population, but 63% of all the killings. And Winnipeg is one of the most dangerous places for Native people interactions with the Winnipeg police. In Winnipeg, Native people only make up 10% of the population, but 64% of all the killings. And we know that just during the pandemic, 8 Indigenous peoples died at the hands of police. You have Aisha Hudson, Jason Collins, and Kevin Stewart Andrews, who were killed by Winnipeg police within a span of 10 days. Aisha's only 16 years old. We have Abraham Natanine and Rodney Levi, who were killed by the RCMP. Chantel Moore, killed by the Edmonton police. Regis Korchinski-Paquette died at the hands of Toronto police. And Everett Patrick, who died in the hands of police. That's all just during the pandemic. So imagine when you would think that there would be less interactions with police during a pandemic where we're all self-isolating and going out is not as popular as it was, that you would have less police killings. Instead, we have this, it seems like an outbreak of police killings. And that doesn't even include all of the people who during this time were brutalized by the police, like Chief Adam Allen Adam from Alberta, who is brutalized by the RCMP, and the many Inuit women who are humiliated, abused, and degraded and assaulted by RCMP in the north, and they've filed complaints against that. Now, imagine living with all of that, and within your communities, you know that there's more than 113 First Nations that don't have clean drinking water, and some haven't for more than 10 years. But the Prime Minister keeps promising, don't worry, we'll deal with it. The housing crisis, I mean, old statistics show that more than 30% of First Nation housing was overcrowded. 43% was in need of major repair, and some of those should have been condemned. There was, as of 20 years ago, a backlog of 110,000 homes, and that doesn't even include all of the housing for Inuit, where their situation is very critical, sometimes 25 people living in a house, or Métis who don't live in communities, except for the Métis settlements in Alberta, who don't have appropriate access to off-reserve housing, for example. And then the health crisis. Should it be any wonder that Indigenous peoples, according to Indian Affairs, who've now restyled themselves Indigenous Affairs or whatever, have a life expectancy of 15 years less than other Canadians? Their infant mortality rate is still 3 times more than Canadians. Disease rates 4 times more. And unintentional injuries 3 times more. The suicide crisis is 2 to 10 times higher than Canadians. In fact, 30% of all youth deaths for Indigenous peoples are suicides. It's beyond imagine that we have First Nations in Ontario who have the highest suicide rates in the entire world, and that includes war-torn countries and post-genocide countries. Highest Canada advertises. Poverty, 60% of First Nations children live in poverty, 60%. But in places like Manitoba, it's 76%. And guess who is disproportionately heading up those households? It tends to be single Indigenous women, not only caring for their kids, but it could be caring for their neighbors' kids, their parents, their extended parents, other community members. So the burden is disproportionately borne on Indigenous women. Now add to that the education crisis, which again, these are older stats, but almost 15 years ago, the Auditor General said that it would take 28 years to close the education gap if we matched all the funding right now, that we equalized it. And of course, we haven't done that. There's more than 9,000 people on a waiting list for post-secondary education for First Nations. And in fact, despite what the government has promised, research has shown that 18% less First Nations and students are getting funded for post-secondary than were funded in 1997. So these statistics explain why there is a 63-year gap for employment, income, and salary. That if we equalized everything right now, we still have to look at our kids and say it's going to be 63 years before we equalize everything. That is unacceptable. That is, I don't know what other word for it. It's criminal, it's genocide, it's unacceptable. These are decisions being made by politicians who know what the results are going to be. And never mind the cultural crisis, where 96% of our languages are at high risk of extinction. And there's been no emergency surge of funding to try to protect that. So what does that mean? What does all of that mean when you're talking about this genocide crisis, this racism and socioeconomic crisis in terms of pandemics and outbreaks and epidemics? Well, we know for sure that tuberculosis, although almost eradicated in the Canadian population, is 40 times higher in First Nations than in the Canadian population. But for Inuit people, it's 290 times higher. Those kinds of statistics literally sound made up. That's how grossly disproportionate they are, and we know why. You cannot stick someone with tuberculosis in a house with 25 other people that doesn't have running water or heat or proper food or health care and not expect that everybody else in the household is going to get tuberculosis, and then the long-term health implications that go with tuberculosis. So how does that translate into pandemics then? Well, you look at H1N1, that was in 2009. We know that at that time, Indigenous peoples were between 3 and 4% of the population, but they represented 28% of all hospital admissions, 26% of those who were critically ill, and 18% of the deaths just in the first wave. And keep in mind that the first wave, any wave of pandemics, it takes a while to get through First Nations. There's always a bit of a delay. But in places like Manitoba, which we've already shown in the other statistics, have worse statistics, Of all the pregnant women that were hospitalized with H1N1, 37% were Indigenous women and girls. So that's a very high risk level for Indigenous women and girls and pregnancy and their unborn babies. And in the Children's Hospital in Winnipeg, just using that one example, 55% of those admitted for H1N1 were First Nations children. And in all of these H1N1 statistics, it was the majority of those impacted were First Nations. So we're talking about a very particular set of risks for First Nations. And even now, we're looking at COVID, and it's constantly being said, oh, thank goodness it's not as high in First Nations. But we have to look at Indian Affairs. First of all, their reporting is not reporting for all Indigenous peoples. They're reporting for some First Nations, but not Métis and not Inuit. And then the numbers that they are reporting don't match with what First Nations are reporting. So Ryerson did an investigation into that, and they did a report, and they showed that while Indian Affairs is reporting 175 cases, First Nations are reporting 465 cases. So this should be no surprise, because Indigenous peoples were not given a priority consideration in their pandemic responses. They've always had problems with statistics, and the trend in recent years, since they've been exposed by the Auditor General and the correctional investigator in the UN about their horrific conditions of Indigenous peoples, is to not trace race, and even some police are starting to stop tracing gender, so that we won't have any statistics on violence against women and girls, and it'll just be all one lump number, and so that we can't point fingers at them. And so right now, federal and provincial governments are talking about, maybe we shouldn't collect race-based, sex-based data. And we're almost through the first wave of this pandemic, and they're still having this conversation. So here's what that means for Indigenous peoples. The key from the World Health Organization to reducing the spread of pandemics is tons of testing, contact tracing, and treatment. You have a situation where First Nations were not being provided test kits, insufficient test kits, or their test kits were being diverted. So we can't even have Indian Affairs giving us the total numbers. So we don't know who's all infected. It's pretty hard to trace, because you trace from the people who are infected. And then how do you treat? How do you prevent all of that? So this is really a recipe for disaster, based on, federal and provincial governments trying to manipulate the data to save face on one hand, but it's going to hurt them on the pandemic. And if you think all of this is overwhelming, yeah, it is. It is overwhelming. Imagine trying to live it or advocate for solutions in this massive context of racial discrimination, a massive pandemic, and genocide, not even to mention the denial of Aboriginal rights, treaty rights, the destruction of native lands without our free, prior, and informed consent. And that's why superficial acts of reconciliation are not going to work. It's not enough to have Indigenous Peoples Day or Native History Week. We have to deal with all of these pandemics at once. And none of this lies at the feet of Indigenous peoples. It's not our fault of genocide. So for COVID, we clearly need an Indigenous specific and a gendered specific pandemic plan that deals with all of the socioeconomic conditions, decarceration, housing, and all of that. For murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, why we don't have a transitional justice plan being led by Indigenous women and supervised by independent, outside, external, international experts is why the conditions continue to get worse. We need that. And for police, we need to defund police. We need to defund racism in policing. And so that's where I'm talking about, because if we defunded just racism in policing, we would no longer need police or the funding for their militarization, their surveillance of Indigenous peoples, police in schools, hospitals, and events. They wouldn't be in First Nations and Inuit communities. There would be less civil suits for all the brutality committed by police. There would be less class actions by RCMP officers themselves against each other and Indigenous peoples against the RCMP. And we would no longer be paying for the immunity of police officers, paying for all of their pay and their legal fees while they're being charged for sexual assaults, gang rapes, and other horrific acts. So those are the three things that we need to do. But for educators, I'm really calling out for you to be intentional about your education. Don't wait on professional development days. Don't wait on things being organized. You need to be intentional, purposeful. You need to seek out this information so that you know. Maybe you teach a kindergarten class and you're not going to be teaching genocide. Okay, but if you don't know that genocide's happening in all the ways in which it manifests, you're not going to be able to teach the things that you do teach in class with the sensitivities that you need to do and engage with the parents that you need to and the communities that you need to. And we also have to keep focusing on curriculum, but also the activities, the conversations, the resources that we use. We have to think about who has voice and power in the education of Native children. And how is that voice and power exercised? Is it always principal, parent, teacher, parent? Or do parents have a voice outside of institutionalized structures like school boards, for example? Because institutions haven't done well by Indigenous peoples, largely exclude them, and they don't have a real substantive voice. I think educators need to scrutinize all of their policies and practices on how they engage with children and families. I'll just use one. You know, if a child comes to school and doesn't have a lunch, that's not a call to CFS. That's having resources there to provide the child with a lunch. Yes, even if that takes resources from something else. It's about finding alternative ways other than criminalizing and racializing the children that you're teaching. And of course, there's professional and personal obligations. What are we doing to make sure that in the wider society, we are taking a stand to end all of this, to stop all of this? We have a moral and legal obligation because we all benefit. All of the programs and services and educations that Canadians enjoy as a matter of right, that all comes from the lands and resources and wealth from Indigenous territories. It all comes from the dispossession of Indigenous peoples, and we don't even have those same rights. So the very same government officials who will take our lands and resources will educate their children in the best schools or in private schools or in whatever they're doing, funded by us. Even the way, if you look at the way the economy is set up, and I'm almost done here, is look at police immunity. Who pays for all of those class action payments, the civil suits, and all of the officers' pay while they're suspended during charges? The victims do. It actually comes from us in the form of tax payments and resources that would have gone to social programs and services are being used so that this police officer can make $1 million while he sits at home for 12 years waiting for his charges to proceed. And so we've got to stop this. We're paying for our own oppression, and that includes Canadians as well. So I wish I had more time. I'd probably give 1,000 other hints, but I thought that the context was the most important because it's a really dire context. But I hope this forum is helpful, even in this pandemic, even though we're not in person and can't carry the conversation on in the same way we do. I really appreciate that you included my voice and that you included the voices of other people from different backgrounds, and really surpassed the old inclinations where we only asked First Nation politicians to speak, or we only asked, political organizations to speak, because, in many ways, they're not on the ground working at these things like community activists are. So it's very important that you actually pick people from the community. And I'm so glad you did. And if we were in person, we could just carry on this conversation, but I have talked as fast as I possibly could to make it all in the time that I had. So I hope that was beneficial, and I hope that we can carry on the conversation in other ways, you know, through future discussions, for example. So thank you, Walalia.
I just want to toss the acknowledgement, Pam. That was amazing, and we've been able to have Chief Kelly LaRocca from Scugog Island. She was kind of sliding out of one meeting, and she's joined us in here. Kelly, did you want to unmute? Do you want to say anything?
Sorry, that took me a minute. I mean, I just want to say thanks so much, Pamela. Your talk was amazing, and I know it was fast and furious, but it had to be, and I get it. I just, I don't know. I was saying in one of my earlier comment remarks that it really, I was itching to get on at least one of these DDSB talks. I know there have been a few so far, and there are others, but it just serves to sort of focus me in the work that I do as the chief, and reminds me of all the different, the scope and breadth of the issues that are going on the ground, as you say. And it's just the whole COVID opportunity, the whole COVID crisis has oddly offered me opportunity to get involved more on the ground, because we have that space to sit and think about how we might engage those issues. So I'm really oddly grateful in a way. Like, COVID has been so difficult for everybody and continues to be, but it's been really good for me to kind of get grounded and reconnect with what's important and why I do the work I do. And you know, we had one of our young people speak, and you just reminded me of something he said in your talk. One of our young people, he's out in Vancouver actually, but he's a member of our community, and he was saying how the breadth and scope of issues that affect Indigenous Canada are so wide-ranging, so complex. He said, all I can ask of my Indigenous brothers and sisters is to pick an issue that sparks your heart and go for it. Just, you know, attack it like a dog on a bone. Don't let it go. You don't need to be the chief. You don't need to be on council. You don't need to, you know, there are ways that all of our people can get involved. And so it was inspiring. I really appreciate it. Miigwech.
Thank you, Kelly, for joining us. And Pam, you've given us a lot to think about. And Erin's going to just show the slide here for a second, because I'm really excited. Dr. Palmater has a new book coming out. You may have noticed Jen and I are twinsing a little bit on purpose. We both have Pam's Warrior Life shirts, and she has a new book that's coming out, and special release for all of us. We're able to order the book if you're interested. There's a discount code, so you get 10% off, and there's the code there, Warrior10. So I know that first thing I said was like, oh, awesome. Our department will have to buy some copies. And then if you haven't already been to Dr. Palmater's website, she has a number of book clubs and really rich resources for people who may have joined us, for whom this is new learning. Look at this as just the beginning of your relationship with Dr. Palmater. I want to really express deep gratitude to everyone that joined us. We honestly thought just 20 people were going to show up. So every time we do this, we're really humbled by everyone that joins us. Special thanks to Dr. Palmater. And again, Erin Elmhurst and John and Justin are behind the scenes making things happen. So miigwech to all of you.